All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. So, I am Andrew, aka Multiple Mindgasms, for the purposes of this video. And I'm going to talk about one of my favorite intellectuals, Jonathan Haidt, the social and moral psychologist, discussing morality on the podcaster, author, and entrepreneur Tim Ferriss's show. And him discussing how morality is emergent rather than pluralistic, how it's not something that it's objectively true or objectively exists, and how there's a difference between and how he's advocating, well, he's not advocating for, he's saying humans are naturally, morality is naturally pluralistic through the process of evolution. It's not relativistic. So yeah, I'll get into all of that more here as we get into the video.
Subject of moral relativism. How do you think about that?
This is a great topic to tackle in a longer discussion because it's one of the oldest questions in philosophy. It's an important one, and it takes a little doing. So there are a lot of intellectual puzzles where we just sort of naturally think about it on like a single dimension or as a binary. And if you kind of break it up into multiple dimensions, then you see solutions. So the typical way of thinking about this.
Yeah, this is why I made the title of this video is Jonathan Haidt is Objective Truth versus Moral Relativism, a False Dichotomy, because it doesn't have to be the case that there's a scientifically objective moral truth in the way that someone like Sam Harris would advocate, as in like science can teach us moral values, but it doesn't mean that the only other alternative is moral relativism, saying that any moral framework is just as equally good as any other moral framework.
Is morality real? Like, is it a real thing? Like the laws of physics, such that if people are behaving contrary to it, they're wrong, even if they don't know it? Or is morality just, and Herodotus and ancient Greeks, they saw this, like, well, in this country, they kill their parents when they get old, and in this country, they eat pigs, and they could see that practices differed. And so, well, maybe, it's just like language. It's just like whatever happens in your culture. Well, that's what's grammatical. But what I learned in part from Schwader, and also reading a lot of philosophy, some of which he guided me to, was I'll put out a couple of concepts. So the first is moral monism versus moral pluralism. So it's the question isn't, is there moral truth or not? It's, is there one moral truth or multiple? And once you do that, now you've loosened things up. Because a hallmark of my work,
I would say a way to put it even better, that as he describes in his work, is one moral framework. And that's why, oh yeah, I forgot to mention when I was describing obviously the title of this video, that I put MFD because my title was too long, but that means his moral foundations theory, which he gets into more, and also the cultural evolution of morality through group selection, as he talks about in his book, The Righteous Mind, in particular, a lot.
Work, and this is where I departed from Rick a bit, is I've always been very influenced by evolutionary psychology as well as anthropology. So we are evolved creatures. We are Homo sapiens, and we are all Homo sapiens, and we are primates, and we have a lot in common with chimpanzees and bonobos. So that's the evolutionary psyche. And then there's also the anthropology. We vary. And so when you look around the world, you don't find infinite variation. You find a few major patterns. A wonderful book, Dancing in the Streets, A History of...
Yeah, so like I was saying, it's not the case that there are just an infinite number of productive and good moral frameworks for societies to thrive. There are multiple different ones that work equally as well for different cultures depending on the culture, but there are not endless ones. There are definitely ones that are bad too, and there's some that are better than others, and there's some that are worse than others.
Of Collective Joy by Barbara Ehrenreich. She says when the European explorers went out in the 16th, 17th century, they found wherever they went, people danced around campfires, had rituals that bonded the group together. They often used psychedelic substances. They had beat heavy music. So this is human nature. But feudal systems are also pretty common. There are a few major patterns. And so one possibility is there's not just one way of doing things, but it's not anything goes. It's that there are several different sort of grammatical human forms. And this actually became the basis of my major work in psychology, which is moral foundations theory, which is my effort to say, what are the taste buds of the moral sense? Because cuisine varies around the world. You wouldn't say that the French are wrong if they don't cook like the Vietnamese, but I think you could say that the French and the Vietnamese are both much better cooks than the English, or at least, they were historically. It's not that anything goes. There is some.
Yeah, and basically in The Righteous Mind, he boils this down to basically different general psychological ideas that different people tend to gravitate towards in terms of their moral framework. And it's the subtitle of The Righteous Mind is something like Why Religion and Politics Divides Us. And he talks about how people are religious people versus non-religious people, and right-wing people versus left-wing people versus libertarian people, and how people tend to be that way because they have a certain psychological mindset that tends to gravitate towards simple things. Like, a lot of people have heard about this before. For example, more liberal people tend to have more empathy, and right-wing people tend to have more discipline and just more willpower and sort of that thing. And there are many different examples of this. So there's kind of an archetype of a left-wing brain, right-wing brain, and libertarian brain. Some of this stuff is oversimplification, of course, but his moral foundations theory is really brilliant and really helps explain how the human brain has naturally evolved to construct multiple different effective moral frameworks for multiple different cultures.
Some truth. But here's where we bring in the second kind of abstract but really powerful concept, which is anthropocentric truth. So that means something can be true relative to to humans, to who we are. So if intelligent aliens come to our solar system, they will find that the Earth is the third planet from the sun. And that was true before we existed, and it'll be true long after we're gone. And they would find that gold is a better conductor of electricity than is aluminum. That was true before we were here, it'll be true, So those are non-anthropocentric truths. There's a fact. And so many people have been on a quest to find what are the moral truths. And so Sam Harris, who for a brief time was my intellectual enemy, we kind of had like a feud for a few years. Now we're friends. We actually like each other quite a lot. But we had kind of a feud over this because he has a whole book, The Landscape of Morality, arguing that moral truths are like the truths of chemistry. And I say, no, they are anthropocentric truths. This is from a philosopher, David Wiggins. There are things that are true because of the creatures we are. So there are things that are beautiful because of our senses. There are things that Shakespeare is a better writer than Kurt Vonnegut. Now, I love reading Kurt Vonnegut. I probably enjoy it more than Shakespeare. But man, I can see, and almost everyone can, Shakespeare is a complete genius at crafting words. Now, it's a fact. If aliens come here from another planet, they're not going to agree because it doesn't.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because if you're talking about Shakespeare versus Kurt Vonnegut, I personally like Kurt Vonnegut a hell of a lot more. Like a lot of people, I'm not really a big fan of Shakespeare's plays, but I find them more interesting when I listen to them as audiobooks, which makes sense because they were meant to be performed as plays originally anyway. But yeah, in terms of all the words he invented, in terms of the way he uses language, and the way he's basically formed archetypical stories that are the formula for a lot of modern books and movies today, that's much more technically impressive than anything that Kurt Vonnegut did. Although he did experiment with telling stories out of sequence and all sorts of weird narrative techniques and just weird writing in general, which is, I mean, technically equally as impressive, if not at least as equally impressive in some ways, for sure. But that's why he said if aliens came to Earth and observed this, they wouldn't agree. And that's why, like, he and I and plenty of other people, of course, can make a distinction between what makes technically a better book and what makes a book that is your preference. But obviously people disagree about that too. Like I was alluding to, how you could make the argument that, for example, Kurt Vonnegut is a much more technically impressive author than Shakespeare in some ways. That might be blasphemous to snooty intellectual people with English degrees, but there's no objective truth about which book is better than another book because it's a matter of personal taste.
It doesn't make sense. It wouldn't fit with their nature. Anyway, so putting this all together, I think what we can say is there are moral truths and moral orders that are emergent. I am not a relativist. I'm not a monist.
Yeah, see, that's an important distinction there too. There, like he said, there are moral truths that are emergent, so they're still morally true, but that doesn't, they're morally subjectively anthropocentrically true, as he said. They're not objectively true as if they're part of the universe, like the laws of physics, as Sam Harris would argue. For example, they would be very different if we were a completely different type of aliens on a completely different planet. There would still be naturally, evolutionarily emergent moral truths that are subjectively morally true for us as a species, that would still be different moral anthropocentric truths, but they would still be true. But that doesn't mean that there's only one moral truth or only one moral framework too. There are multiple different ones, but that doesn't mean that there are infinite possibilities in terms of moral frameworks that are workable, and there are some moral frameworks that are better or worse than other moral frameworks. This nuance is important, though, so that's why the idea of objective truth versus moral relativism is a false dichotomy. Moral pluralism, not moral relativism.
I'm a moral pluralist. There are multiple moral truths, and these truths are emergent from human nature interacting as people interact in societies. Okay, wow. I think I just did it.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, Jonathan Haidt is great as always. And yeah, that's why he is one of my favorite intellectuals, and I'm a big fan of his work. I like all of his books. The Happiness Hypothesis, about basically there are a lot of similarities between different religions and mythologies throughout the history of human civilization, and before that follow basically similar archetypes, like kind of like what Carl Jung talks about, similar anyway. And also The Righteous Mind, to basically describe that one. And then his newer one, The Coddling of the American Mind, is about how, basically wokeness started in colleges in 2015, and a lot of it centers around kids who were raised through helicopter parenting and safetyism, which led to them being so emotionally fragile. And he talks about how you can use cognitive behavioral therapy to become more anti-fragile and be more effective in your environment, and the importance of freedom of speech and that kind of thing. And it's really good too, because he's not a right-wing guy who pretends to care about freedom of speech. He really does. And he's like kind of center left leaning, I would say. And he was very traditionally liberal, but pushed farther, a little bit farther right when he wrote The Righteous Mind. But I would say he's like centrist or center left still. But yeah, check out Jonathan Haidt's books if you haven't read them. He has very interesting and educational thoughts about morality that, as I've said many times on my channel here before, he is one of the many reasons why I stopped being a militant atheist like Sam Harris, because I learned that through his work also, that through cultural evolution, through group selection, we have learned this is how religions have thrived throughout human history, and this is why they still persist, because they serve an important function of bonding societies together. And there are certainly negative consequences, but there are some pros. It's not all cons. And basically, I would say I'm more of an agnostic atheist now, or an indifferent atheist. I don't really care whether someone is religious or not. They don't have to agree with me. And I don't think that any god or gods exist. But no one actually knows whether they do or not, because as far as we know, no one has died and then come back from the dead to tell us what the afterlife is actually like. And whether a God exists or not has basically no impact whatsoever on my daily life. If I actually saw evidence of God, that would totally change my life. But since I have no idea, and neither does anyone else, then it has no impact on my life whatsoever, and no impact whatsoever on most people's lives, other than people who believe it, who gain a lot from it. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as they don't evangelize against people, right? Or to people, rather. Anyway, thanks a lot for hopefully appreciating this video about me appreciating Jonathan Haidt's thoughts on morality as much as I did. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Last one I did was with podcasts with my friend Daniele Bolelli, the historian, author, podcaster, and mixed martial artist, and we talked about the newer Lord of the Rings Rings of Power show versus the House of the Dragon show, and why Lord of the Rings of Power show didn't work, but the House of the Dragon show did. And probably this weekend, I'm also going to finally do that podcast I've been planning on doing with my friend Dusty, who I often do podcasts with, on Children of Dune, which is the third book in Frank Herbert's original Dune series. So check that out as well. And I'm also probably soon going to be doing a podcast with my friend Chris about Ancient Apocalypse, which is the documentary series on Netflix hosted by Graham Hancock, who is a journalist who's been studying archaeology for decades. And basically, he looks into, his theory is that a lot of ancient monolithic structures like the pyramids in Egypt and a lot of others throughout the world are much older than mainstream archaeology would have us believe. And he's connected this among other people, and this is taken a little more serious now. He's connected this to the Younger Dryas impact theory, which is the idea that about 12,000 years ago, during the last ice age, there was a massive bombardment of comets that wiped out all existing, or not all, but most existing life at the time, and humanity barely survived. And he connects this, along with other people, to his idea of an advanced lost civilization, and claims that they were likely wiped out by this comet bombardment called the Younger Dryas impact theory about 12,000 years ago during the last ice age. So yeah, definitely check out all that upcoming stuff and all my past stuff. And yeah, like I always say, oh yeah, check out my Patreon page too. The link is in the description of the video. As always, any amount that you want to give me per month is greatly appreciated. And yeah, like I always say, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And Jonathan Haidt is a fascinating thinker and one of my favorite intellectuals, and you should read all his books if you haven't already, for sure. And let me know what you think about morality in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with me or Jonathan Haidt about it. I'd be very interested to hear what people think, as long as you're not a dick. I'll talk with you if you're being nice and wanting to have a conversation. I'm going to ignore you if you're being a dick. All right. So looking forward to that, continuing this conversation in the comments. Thanks again, everyone, for watching. Check out all of Jonathan Haidt's works, and adios until next time, everyone. Ta-ta, bitches.